All right. Well, thank you, Maricela. Appreciate that. Hi, everybody, and thank you for coming tonight. I'm going to talk to you, as promised, about purple martins in California. Um, I I'm not always sure somebody does a background, so real quickly, I'll just mention a few things. I'm a wildlife biologist by training. I'm a retiree, and I am now an independent researcher and conservation planner, which basically means I fund most of my own studies. But there is an exception that we'll talk about later. I've been working, as Maricela said, on bird and natural resource conservation issues, all in Northern California for the last, I guess it's 43 years now. And I began working on purple martins in 1991 in Sacramento without ever expecting to be continuing to work on them for so long, but here I am. Uh, I've worked extensively with martins at other sites throughout Northern California, including last year at Willits Bypass, which we'll talk about toward the end of the talk. And then I've also done some limited work with martins in Arizona, Washington, state and in the eastern U.S. So I probably am the state's expert on purple martins, but it's a pretty small club. Um, I thought I would start by giving you just a little introduction to martins. They're one of those species that are so rare that people don't generally know very much about them and aren't very aware of them. Your area in the North Coast is one of the few areas where people can see martins regularly. But they are the largest North American swallow. They are, of course, abundant and well studied in the East, where they use the apartment style nest boxes. In fact, all of the birds nesting in the Eastern North America nest in boxes. There are no naturally nesting populations left there. Um, they're much more common in the East and very much less common in the West. They're a cavity nester, so that means they're susceptible to nest site competition from the European starling and house sparrows, which is a conservation challenge, both of those being non-native species. They nest colonially, which creates some uh, issues with respect to what kinds of habitat is suitable, how do you find them, and how do you manage them. They are an aerial insectivore, so they take all of their prey on the wing, flying insects, which also, again, has conservation issues regarding things like pesticides that are affecting insect populations, as we know. And then this is just kind of a gee whiz fact. Unlike most other swallows, purple martins have a delayed plumage maturation in the males. So this bird at the bottom is actually the bird at the top is an adult male courting a adult female. The bird at the bottom is a subadult or second year adult, which you can recognize by a little bit of darker coloration on the side of the head, the purplish, and then some kind of randomly scattered purple feathers generally in the breast and belly. But they are uh, lighter in the west than the east. Um, the I'm having trouble reading the top of my screen, so I apologize. Purple martin status in California. This species was designated as a species of special concern in 1978. Um, so almost 50 years ago. The threats identified at the time were habitat loss, competition with non-native or alien species, but notably pollution or pesticides was not really identified as a threat in the 2008 account I worked on with another individual to summarize the status of the species. In 1978, there's a book that was published on all of the species of special concern. And the Department of Fish and Wildlife said at the time they were committed to continued investment in population assessment and adaptive management as tools for effective conservation. Well, in fact, no assessment or really any statewide conservation actions have been taken on behalf of the purple martin until this year, which again I will talk about. So the ball was has sort of been dropped by the resource agencies at this point. Um, and most of the work that's been done on assessment and conservation and management has been done independently and locally by conservation groups, agencies, and individuals. So this is the breeding distribution from eBird. Photo I took off of my screen. It's not very good, but it gives you the general distribution of the entire species, all of its subspecies in North America above Mexico, because of course Mexico is part of North America, right? Um, but as you can see, the distribution is and abundance is a lighter and spottier in the west than out here in the east, where these dark colors indicate high abundance. So just to summarize some of the differences between the three subspecies that exist, there's the eastern martin, there's the desert or southwestern martin, and there is the western purple martin. The breeding range is shown here: eastern North America, the Sonoran Desert, where the birds nest in these saguaro cactuses almost exclusively, and then the western martins are in along the Pacific and in montane areas in the west for the most part. They winter in different locations. The eastern martin goes to the Amazon. We're just getting a few satellite transmitters on desert martins. I say we, I'm not really doing it. But they're getting a few on to understand where those birds are going. Our western birds, the few that have been tracked, go to a completely different area from the eastern birds on the Atlantic coast of Brazil. The status and trends, the eastern martins are abundant, but they are declining slowly. And this probably relates to the dependence on humans and backyard nest boxes like these shown at the bottom here. And as the population ages and becomes more urban, the newer generation is not taking up the hobby as readily. And there's quite an effort to try to encourage new so-called landlords to come into the picture. The trend, the abundance of the desert martin seems to be pretty high, but it's really not been assessed. But there are threats, particularly the establishment of non-native grasses that are carrying fires in the Sonoran Desert region and killing the saguaro cactuses when the fires burn through there. In the western birds, we'll talk more about, but the population is low and the status is either declining in some areas or stable. This shows you the distribution of the western martin. So essentially north of the Sonoran Desert and west of the Colorado Rockies, both in montane areas in the Rockies, the basin ranges in Nevada and Utah, and then along the coast here. Apparently, all of these populations are the same subspecies. Just a few comparisons, the species, the eastern versus western. I mentioned some of this, but they're genetically distinct. The sort of genetic time clock says that these populations were mostly separated about 200,000 years ago during Ice Age. They're much less abundant. We probably have a population of about maybe 7,000 total birds in the entire western region versus 12 million. Maybe that number 7,000 has gone up a little bit, and we'll know more after this year about what the California population is. But regardless, it's at least 3 orders of magnitude less abundant in the West. The plumage is different. So if you look at Sibley or National Geographic, oftentimes they only show the eastern birds, and the females here are much lighter in color. They don't have the grayish markings that you see. This is actually that same subadult male picture I showed before. They are larger by only a small amount, about 2 to 4% larger, the Western birds. And the main thing is they use different nest sites. They don't use the apartment style nest boxes that the Eastern Martins use. This shows you the distribution of what different nest site types are used within the range of the Western Purple Martin. And so as you can see here, as you move from north to south, the northern population was just about wiped out. And it's been brought back from very small numbers. In British Columbia, the population was as low as 30 birds. And it's now up, last that I heard, it's around 4,000, 100% in nest boxes. So they recovered that population. In Washington, it's about 80%, 90% nest boxes, but there are a few in the forest. Interestingly, mainly at Fort Lewis, where they are the live fire training sets off a lot of fires and creates a lot of snags that maintains habitat for martins there. Oregon, it's about 50-50 and maybe a little more towards 75% boxes based on what I just heard a couple of days ago. But then look at California. Most of the birds, this is as of about 2 years ago, our knowledge was that almost all the birds were nesting in snags. About 10% are nesting in bridges. We only have had 4 nest box colonies in the last 20 years in California, and some of those are no longer active. Well, I'll just say I'm going to update this for you based on my review of eBird records that I did several months ago. In other Western states, it's all snags, Colorado and Utah. So let's zoom in one more level to the status of the birds in California. They were formerly considered locally common throughout the state. This would be Grinnell and Miller, who were the preeminent ornithologists who published the book, The Distribution of the Birds of California in 1944. So they called them locally common in most areas of the state except high mountains and the desert. And they said that the range had expanded as the birds were colonizing buildings. So it used to be, and some of you may be old enough to remember, that there were city-dwelling martins in most of the Central Valley towns, so Sacramento and the foothill towns, Sacramento, Auburn, Colusa, Chico, Oroville. Most of these towns had birds nesting in generally in tile roof buildings where they could use the holes created by those tiles and bred there. But unfortunately, in the late 1960s and early 70s, the European starling, non-native starling, arrived in California, excuse me, as a breeding species, and that very rapidly eliminated large numbers of martins and substantially shrunk their population. So that in the Central Valley, for example, the only population that has remained since the 70s has been in Sacramento. They are now highly localized, except in the North Coast region, where they seem to be doing fairly well. But again, I'll get into this in a moment. This shows you the distribution as portrayed by eBird. And this really somewhat overstates the abundance just because of the size of the squares. They're really much more locally distributed, especially inland, whereas the distribution is relatively continuous in forested regions in the coast. So what do we know about the status and population trend? I mentioned that there haven't been a lot of survey work done. Well, there really haven't been any comprehensive population surveys. Brian Williams, a master's student at Sac State, summarized all of the historical records of martins through 1998 for a master's thesis. um, and documented the declines that I just talked about. And then he and I put together the species of special concern account, which updated the abundance through 2004, although it took until 2008 for them to publish it. But that was estimated, the population then was estimated at about 1,300 to 1,800 nesting pairs in the state. In 2019, I was preparing to lead a statewide assessment of the status of martins, and our funding was pulled by the main funder, the California Department of Fish and Wildlife, for unknown reasons. And so we limped ahead with some volunteers. Sarah Grimes, some of you may know, who lives out on the coast in Mendocino, was a big helper on this. And we put together a status assessment in Northern California. And then since then, there's been localized long-term or periodic monitoring at a few sites. And we get, of course, a lot of scattered records in eBird and places like that. And then this year, conducted a summary of the minimum numbers of nesting pairs based on eBird records, which I'll report on in a moment here. The 2009 population assessment is kind of our baseline for looking at the status where we had pretty good data. We evaluated the abundance at sites where we had adequate historical information. So we only really had 4 sites where prior to 2009, there was a reasonably good estimate of how many birds were present. Only 4 sites. We also looked at occupancy, though. We had a larger number of sites where we said, well, the martins are there. Are they still there? And that survey was conducted at about 45 sites in 15 different Northern California counties. So not comprehensive, but it set a baseline that we can use and plan to use this year to look at how the numbers have changed at these sites surveyed in 2009. So I'll just give you this is really a demonstration of how fragmentary the information is, but this is what we know about the sites where abundance was determined. Shasta Lake, overall, a scattering of surveys, but there's no indication of a decline there. It seems stable. Red Hills Road, we had 3 years of data. These dates are supposed to line up here across here. So we had 3 dates in the 2000s where the numbers stayed the same. Unfortunately, that's no longer the case, and I'll talk about that in a moment. At Gualala River Bridge, this was just a breeding bird survey site where they would stop as one of the 50 3-minute stops that they make and count martins. So high variability because you're only there for three minutes, but no indication of a decline. And then in Sacramento, the population declined, which I'll show you in a minute. If you look at the regions, and evaluate the occupancy, what proportion of the sites that were present, primarily in the 1980s, the 1990s, what proportion of those sites were still occupied in 2009? And you can see that basically about 58% were still occupied. So we lost a lot of birds from a number of sites. If you look at trees and snags, that's where most of the loss occurred, which perhaps is not too surprising because snags come and go as rot occurs. But even at the permanent sites, bridges and in utility poles and towers, we lost 44% of the population. So not real good, but not real good quality data, but not great indication of the status. Much of the Central Coast losses, where the losses were so high, Again, we had relatively few sites. Most of those were bridges that became overgrown with vegetation that precluded the birds from getting inside. So it's not always something nefarious. Some of it is somewhat natural. But overall, this loss would represent lose about 3% of the sites per year being lost. Well, what are some of the recent indications of population status? Well, unfortunately, we have some negative indicators. This top left photo is Lava Beds National Monument, a really unique, interesting site where there are these underground lava tubes and caves that were formed when the lava ran out of um, whatever the source of the lava was there, which the mountain I've forgotten. But it created these underground caves. If you've ever been there, it's a really fascinating place. So the birds were nesting underground at lava beds. And they were documented to be there for almost a century, but they disappeared about 10 years ago. We thought that all this burning that was taking place would be good for martins, creating snags and open habitat. But unfortunately, the surveys that have been done, uh, which were done primarily to look for blackback woodpeckers, um, only 3 sites out of 133 that were surveyed by the Institute for Bird Populations uh, produced martins. So it appears that they're not colonizing these burned areas very readily. Um, I mentioned the Clear Lake utility corridor site, which I said was stable. Well, I went back there last year and we had seen 23 pairs in 2009. Last year there was one because the birds were nesting in these insulators that held up separated the transmission lines from each other, and they changed out the spacers, and those spacers didn't have holes in them, which is what the birds were nesting in. So that population disappeared, a local effect. But has that happened elsewhere? We don't really know. We had we had one nest box colony that my colleague and I started in Shelter Cove in Humboldt County. A second one appeared at Napa County about 5 years ago. And after 3 years, we had 5 pairs using them. They disappeared for unknown reasons. So that was a big disappointment because if we could get this colony, this colonial nesting in nest boxes going, that would be beneficial to the birds. And then you can see the decline in the Sacramento population, which declined by 89% from 173 pairs to 19 pairs last year over a 22-year period. The reasons for that, I searched for. This was my study, and for 10 years, I looked for reasons, tried to fathom what were the reasons for this decline. And it turns out it's completely correlated with the rapid increase in the use of neonicotinoid pesticides in both agricultural and residential use in the Sacramento region. There are some positive indicators of population success. Looking at the eBird data, which I did, suggests that there's still moderate abundance in coastal forests, presumably because there's not a lot of pesticide being used there, and starlings don't like heavily forested areas. I did do some resurvey work of bridge colonies along the Mendocino coast, Highway 1, and some snag colonies there. And all of the sites that were occupied in 2009 still remain occupied. In fact, one site that had been occupied and then was unoccupied in 2009 was recolonized. And so the numbers there seem similar. I didn't use the recent surveys didn't use a complete protocol that we used in 2009 and we're planning to use again this year. but the numbers appear pretty similar. And then one thing that I'll talk more about that's really exciting and should be a source of local pride for you guys is this major colony that established in the Highway 101 Willits bypass. Um, and then this is not supposed to be a nested comment. Nest boxes have been occupied now in coastal Mendocino County just in the last couple of years, and in Santa Clara County. And then I can't read the one at the bottom because oh oh yes, and then there's interestingly the population in the entire Sierra Nevada has pretty much disappeared south of Yuba County, which is in the north portion of the Sierra. But there's a small population that is moving north using transmission towers in the lower conifer region in Fresno County now. And so that will be interesting to watch and see whether that population expands into more natural habitat, whether they continue to use other tower sites and continue to move north. So conclusions regarding statewide status. In these four regions, we have substantial declines or actual outright extirpation. Central Valley, Sierra Nevada, the East and South Bay area, and then lowland, Southern California. The Central Coast region, the jury's still out a little bit. I think that the population is probably stable. That's using the snags in the conifer region. The bridge colonies have declined, but we're still seeing a fair number of birds in conifer areas. And then the North Bay area and the North Coast region, the birds still appear to be relatively abundant and the population's stable, but we'll be checking on that through our survey this year. Based on limited data, and again, why is it different? Starling abundance, insecticide use, and I would add to these inland areas, climate change, drier conditions, producing fewer insects probably is having an effect as well. So I keep mentioning this statewide survey, so let me give you a little bit of background on that. The goals of this survey are to determine the current distribution and changes in distribution of the species within the state, to evaluate the breeding size and trends in the statewide and regional populations to the extent we can do that. We're also describing the nesting habitat and the potential conflicts that arise from the various types of nesting situations. And we're going to use all this information to develop a conservation strategy and a set of specific actions that hopefully can be taken to maintain or recover this population. That picture at the bottom is looking up into one of the weep holes in the underside of a bridge, such as occurs at Willits Bypass. I'll have more pictures of that in a minute. So I mentioned that I conducted this eBird review this last year for records from 2011 to 2024. Prior to 2011, eBird wasn't used all that much, but I spent about 2 weeks going through 9,000 eBird records and searching for information. I screened out the migratory records, some of which occur while birds in California are breeding. We still have migrants moving through, going north to British Columbia and Washington. And I tried to identify sites that either had some confirmation of breeding based on the comments that appeared in the eBird records, or were likely to be breeding based on the numbers, the length of time within the season, and the number of different seasons in which martins were recorded. I'm assuming all of you are somewhat familiar with what eBird is, but if you have questions, I can talk about that later. We tried to confirm breeding based on what I call diagnostic breeding behaviors. So if you see certain behaviors like birds carrying nesting material, carrying food to the nest, taking a fecal sac from the nest out to drop it away from the nest, or you hear young or see young in the holes, then you know you have a breeding pair. And also, if you repeatedly see birds, you can at a site you can generally infer that the birds are breeding and you can count them. So based on that information and our and surveys we're going to conduct, um, well, I really didn't give you much information about the survey, but let me just say quickly, we took the eBird records, which were about 200 identified nesting sites in California, and we're going to select about 85 of those and survey them on the ground using a three-pass survey. So we get them when they're early and establishing their nesting, when they're feeding young, and then late in the season when the younger birds that start breeding later uh, bring their when they are feeding their young. So we'll visit these sites 3 times to come up with a population estimate. We can compare the numbers that we get in our survey to the numbers that eBird recorded during surveys over the previous 5 years. And we come up with what I'm calling an eBird correction factor. Birders, I hope nobody's insulted by this, but birders tend to underestimate colonial birds. You're busy, you're trying to get as many species as possible. You see a couple of martins, you put down 2 martins. Well, when we see martins at our survey sites, we'll spend an hour watching, counting how many adults, how many females, how many holes are being entered. And so our numbers are higher, but we can index by going to the same sites, we can index these numbers and come up with a correction factor that we can apply to the eBird data to say, well, they've reported 6, but it's actually probably 15. So we can use a correction factor to estimate the total numbers at all eBird sites. But then remember, eBirders don't get to go everywhere. Roads aren't there, it's private property. So we're then going to develop a model using density of birds at areas surveyed by eBird. So we can say, okay, there's an average of 1 bird per 1,000 acres that's covered by eBird. And we can apply that density factor to those areas that are considered suitable habitat that are not being surveyed by eBird or by us. So we can then combine the numbers from our surveys, from the eBird with the correction factor applied, and this habitat population model to derive a total estimated population for the state as a whole. And that number is important because it affects how people think about the birds. If there are 10,000 birds, it's a different story than if there are 1,000 birds. So this is important for us to try to estimate, and we should have that estimate by the end of this or shortly after the end of the field season. Well, going through these data, I'll just give you a quick look at the kinds of things that came out of eBird. This shows you the number of breeding sites and the number of breeders that eBird reported by region in the state. And what you can see here is that the coastal forest areas, as I mentioned before, the North Coast Range, the North Bay, and the Central and South Coast have most of the martins, again, because less pesticide use and fewer starlings. And the breeding is very sparsely distributed in overall. I mean, these are large areas to have only 31 pairs, known in the North Bay. But looking at the inland areas, only 5 sites known to support martins in the entire northern Sierra Nevada. So very sparse and again, not completely surveyed, but I think we'll come to the same conclusion after we complete our overall study. The numbers and the historical information suggest regional differences in status. It appears that the inland birds have declined. The coastal birds seem to be doing well. And again, just reminding you, these are the eBirded sites only. So we also could look at, well, where are the birds nesting? And unfortunately, a lot of eBirders do not report much information other than the numbers that they see. So I'm going to encourage you, if you see purple martins, would you please write down things in the notes in eBird about what are they doing? Or what kind of behavior did you observe? What kind of sites were they using? And that would be helpful to us. But based on 157 breeding sites where I was able to get information, these are the different nesting substrates that are being used. Snags and trees, about over half. Um, Utility structures, this surprised me somewhat, the number of wooden utility poles that are being used in certain areas by purple martins. And then we have quite a substantial proportion of the population using these bridge areas where, again, they're going into the undersides of the bridges through these so-called weep holes. I do want to note that snags are probably underrepresented here because people tend to say more about utility poles and bridges. And in a lot of cases, it's sort of assumed that it's a snag, but they didn't say it was, so we couldn't record it. So I think probably we'll see a higher percentage as we get more information. I mentioned the utility pole was a surprise, and then, oh yeah, we only now have 2 nest box sites that are known, both of which are within 1 mile of each other at Albion on the coast. So kind of starting to wrap up here. Based on what we learned about these nesting substrates, there are certain threats, but also opportunities that are posed. With respect to snags, the threats consist of the loss of historical sites as snags fall and as they get removed. One of our main sites where this bird was on the top is Shelter Cove. And there was a big fire that went through there, I think it was in the 60s, and created all these snags, but they're falling down on their own. And as people are developing their residential lots, they're removing the snags. There's also, a threat, if you will, is the lack of recruitment into new burns. That unfortunately, perhaps again because of drier conditions, we're just not seeing birds move into burns. Even age management systems, clear cutting, seed tree cutting, tend to create the same, not very much difference in structure of the habitat. And, martins like to be in open areas, so they like to be in that large snag that's above the forest canopy, or even a snag that's in the middle of a clear cut. But a lot of even age management is not creating habitat that the birds can use. There are opportunities in terms of snag management. If where we have burns that are in cooler, wetter areas, those areas could be creating snags as they did at Shelter Cove. And if we can recognize that, we can put more management attention in those areas where martins are more likely to occur. There's also the opportunity to recruit snags in clear cuts. You guys may know more about logging than the general population, but one system used for even age management are seed trees, where they clear cut a patch of forest, but they leave 1 or 2 trees per acre to be the seed source for the next generation of trees. Well, oftentimes those seed trees are then removed once the new seedlings begin to grow. But those could be retained and managed as snags for martins. Again, it doesn't have to be everywhere, but in areas where it's likely that martins could benefit. With respect to utility structures, the threats include one that I've only come to, that I mentioned to you for Clear Lake, is this change from more suitable to less suitable transmission line structures. And we just don't know the extent to which that is happening. whether Clear Lake was an isolated incident or some sort of a trend. One thing that is clear is that wooden poles, like this one being used by this male martin, are being replaced by these wire wrapped poles, poles with this hardware cloth wire put on it, specifically to discourage woodpeckers from making holes. So as these poles become less and less sound, there's potential for outages and such. And so when they are considered threatened, they're removed, but they're replacing them with a pole that is not going to become suitable in the future. Undergrounding of utility lines obviously is another source of loss of poles if they are removed. But the opportunities do exist if we could coordinate effectively with utilities to leave the old poles in place when they put a new one in, and possibly to add nest boxes in areas that are being used, where poles are being used by martins. Finally, then, with respect to bridges, this picture here shows you construction that occurring at a Sacramento colony site, and you can see these upside down cones are excluders to prevent birds from entering the holes. And they did block off all the holes that were being used by 2 of the 5 remaining colonies, but we managed to coordinate with them and get those removed, and the birds have remained and have been nesting successfully in these holes, despite all this construction activity going on right nearby. So threats include, one is replacement of suitable designs, the designs that are called the hollow Bach girder design structure that have these weep holes, with other designs that don't provide nesting opportunities. Disturbance during construction and maintenance can be a problem, but almost as insidious is the excessive exclusion of birds during construction, as I described here. Had they not removed these, we would have lost those birds. Perhaps they would have gone somewhere else, but this is where they chose to be. And it turned out they did quite well with all this construction activity. So getting, this exclusion really is not a means of protecting birds from construction. It's a way to protect construction from birds. Because if birds start nesting, there's a threat that these sites could be shut down for construction. So in this case, we did it all informally, but we had to get agreement from the agencies, Caltrans, Fish and Wildlife, that this was worth trying. And if it didn't work, nobody was going to be punished. And that's the only reason we were able to get these removed. And it worked great because the birds did come, they tolerated the disturbance, and bred successfully. Another problem with bridges is that it's a place where homeless encampments occur, and we've had some major fires because we have some major encampments under some of these bridge areas. Caltrans has apparently taken a new, I guess there was a new law passed that allows removal of homeless camps more readily, and Caltrans has been cleaning those areas up. I'm not unsympathetic to homeless people, but it is a management problem at Purple Martin colonies, and to some degree, a safety issue for those of us monitoring them. But there are opportunities here as well. Better activity coordination, as we had with Caltrans on this project. I mean, I've been trying to get Caltrans to pay attention to martins for 20 years, and with very little success. And finally, with this project, they finally understood, and the biologists got excited. And I did training for 20, 30 biologists, and now they've got religion and they're doing great things. So it took a long time, but we have made progress with Caltrans. Another thing that is an opportunity that might be contemplated at Willets bypass, for example, is installing these so-called nest guards. So one of the potential drawbacks, or it is a drawback of these vertical weep holes, is that the young tend to congregate around the entrances and fall out sometimes. And so you lose a certain amount of reproduction. On average, it's about one bird per three nests. But a very creative guy from California, Audubon, came up with this idea of putting these little wire sleeves in and creating a railing. So it's pushed up above the edge, the bottom edge of the hole or the top edge of the hole. And it creates a little railing so that they're less likely to fall out. And those could be installed if needed to increase reproduction. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about the State Route 101 bypass. Actually, Maricela was going to talk about it, but she's tending to a baby, not hers, her daughters, I guess, or sons, I forgot. Anyway, State Route 101 Willets bypass. So this area that I am guessing most of you know was completed, construction was completed in, I guess, in over stages in 2014 to 2016. It's about 4.2 miles long, and about 1.5 miles of it are elevated, thereby creating these, with this hollow box girder structure, creating these holes beneath. The first use of the bridge by Martins was only in 2021, so that's like 4 years ago. And I learned about this and from a friend of mine at Caltrans, one of my Martin protectors, Martin fan club members, and he connected me with Maricela, and she reported to me, "Oh, we've got lots of Martins," and so I worked with her on teaching her the methods for censusing the birds, which again involve mapping what holes the birds are going in and out of over time and identifying diagnostic nesting behaviors. And I made a visit out there last July, the 11th and 12th, and we worked together to figure out the numbers of birds. So there's Maricela in the field. This is not her data sheet, it's mine. Um, but I thought you just might be amused to see how we actually do this. You know, we make a map, first of all, and then you assign numbers and letters so that every hole has a unique identifier. And then we just record for each hole how many males, that's after second year males, the adult males, how many females, how many second year males, how many unidentified birds go into each of these holes, and what kinds of behaviors are they exhibiting. This one was carrying food, and we heard young calling. We heard them in the nest. So by recording this stuff and then putting it in a spreadsheet over time, you can come up with a population estimate. And our mapping showed that 27 pairs of birds were using that Willett site. I mentioned about the eBird correction factor. The highest number that had been reported in eBird for this site before we censused it was, I believe, 8 birds. And so we found 54 birds. And it just goes to show you that, especially in these big sites, it's very challenging unless you execute a pretty rigorous protocol. So how significant is this area? Well, guess what? This is the largest known colony site in California. Shelter Cove had close to the same numbers, but a lot of those were in nest boxes that have not been maintained because the person that helped us moved away. So this is probably the largest colony in California. Its large size, it results from really ideal conditions. You have abundant nest holes. There are over 100, at least 100 holes in this bypass structure that birds can use. But most importantly is the insect supply that these grassland and wetland areas are producing that the birds can use. So this rapid adoption, going from no birds or maybe a few birds in 2021 to 74 birds in 2024, is really astounding. And that rapid adoption indicates a healthy regional population because birds had to be coming in from other areas. This couldn't just have grown so quickly from just one pair of birds that colonized. So it suggests that there are other birds being produced, enough birds that they're looking for new places to grow. It also indicates that this colony is highly successful reproductively, and reproduction, again, because of lack of insects, has been a major source of decline in other areas. So you really have a very unique and very moving area. I went out to that site, and it was like all of the colonies were in Sacramento 20 years ago, where there are so many birds flying around and so many holes being entered, you just could barely track it. And that's completely disappeared. Now our in Sacramento, now our colonies are two, three, four pairs. So this really took me back to the good old days, and I hope that this will continue. I might just mention there's you though you people know that probably that there's a new bridge being built on Highway 20, and now I'm forgetting the name of where it is there, but it's I think at the north end of Lake Mendocino, and I think that's going to be a Martin magnet also, and that's something to keep an eye on because it's long, it's very open, it's next to water, and I would predict that it should be filling up with martins over the next 3, 4 years. So that I think is all I had for tonight, and I guess I did fill up my time. So I hope I didn't put you all to sleep. And if you have questions or anything, or if corrections, if there are things you want to correct me on, please let me know.